Good afternoon. Before we start, I'd like to mention that we have simultaneous interpretation in French on channel 2. Bonjour, avant de commencer, je voudrais vous rappeler que nous avons interprétation simultanée au canal 2. Welcome everyone to this Financing Fairly side event and launch for the report, Are Public Finance Institutions in Southern Africa Financing the Climate Crisis? The side event and report are a product of the work of the Fair Finance Coalition in Southern Africa. We have a number of panelists here representing diverse organizations, and I will introduce them during the program. Here's our program for this session in brief. Firstly, we will hear about the Fair Finance Network and Coalition in Southern Africa. We will then hear an overview of the report, followed by responses from some of the panelists. Finally, we will have a Q&A session and will invite your feedback. During and after the event, please engage with the Fair Finance Coalition on social media by using the hashtag FairFinanceSA. My name is Marcelo Borges Doroso, and I am the Program Officer for the Voices for Just Climate Action program at HIVOS in Brazil. And before I give the floor to our speakers, I would like to talk briefly about HIVOS' work on climate finance for the local level. At HIVOS, we believe that climate finance is crucial for fighting climate change and coping with its consequences. A just distribution of these resources is equally important, as well as more money to adaptation. In other words, climate finance should be directed to the local communities that already face disastrous climate impacts. Research has shown us that climate solutions in which local communities are highly involved are the most effective. In fact, climate solutions of indigenous peoples, women, young people, have proven to be very beneficial beyond climate impacts. They have contributed to poverty alleviation, gender equality, and sustainable development. And that is because they take indigenous and local knowledge into account. They take local context into account, and therefore they're more holistic in their approach. We all know that climate finance is failing to reach these communities and their local solutions. There are numerous reasons why this is happening. Climate funds favor big projects, have complicated application processes and reporting systems in place. High requirements and lots of finance is also distributed in loans. So the conversation of today is about public finance institutions. The Fair Finance Coalition Southern Africa have assessed how well some financial institutions are doing with regards to sustainable development, poverty alleviation, gender equity, socially owned renewable energy projects, and climate resilient infrastructure. In other words, is the way they are financing projects really contributing to climate justice? We will start the side event by hearing a video input from Liane Govensamy from Fair Finance member organization, the Center for Environmental Rights.
Good day, my name is Liane Govensamy and I head up the Corporate Accountability and Transparency Program at the Center for Environmental Rights. I am also a part of the Fair Finance Coalition Southern Africa, and we're really proud today to be launching our most recent policy assessment, focusing on 6 development finance institutions: the African Development Bank, the Export Credit Insurance Corporation, the Industrial Development Corporation, the New Development Bank, the Public Investment Corporation as well. The policy assessment, focusing on 8 thematic areas and following a standardized methodology, offers civil society and the broader public a really important avenue and instrument to be able to engage with the policies of development finance institutions. I really want to reflect today on one of the reasons why a policy assessment is really important, and particularly relevant for today, for the environment in which we are operating, and that is an environment which requires us to engage on issues of climate finance that is required in order to advance just energy transitions around the world. In assessing the lending and investment policies of 6 public finance institutions, we as the Fair Finance Coalition Southern Africa are creating a repository of information, of analyses, with which to be able to tackle a number of issues related to accountability, transparency, access to information, etc. But I really want to reflect today on one of the critical areas of work with which we are engaging, and that is climate finance. Being able to navigate issues of climate finance starts off with being able to understand the role of public finance institutions and the role that they play in advancing just transitions around the world, just energy transitions around the world. So this policy assessment comes at a really important time. If we look at South Africa, for example, during the COP26 last year, there was a major announcement that there would be 8.5 billion USD that would be offered to South Africa through an investment deal. This was part of a political declaration amongst a number of countries of our global north committing to advancing a just energy transition in South Africa. This was cautiously welcomed by civil society actors in South Africa, and ever since then we've been trying to understand what is this Just Energy Transition Partnership, or what is this JETP? What is it all about? What does it offer South Africa? What are the risks and opportunities that arise from this JETP process? Public finance institutions will be contributing to this 8.5 billion USD. There is a lot of skepticism from civil society, from a variety of actors around what this will look like. What is the nature of the concessional finance that will be applied to this JETP? How much of it will be grants? What are the loan repayment terms or the debt repayment schedules? What will they look like? What conditionalities will be applied to it? These questions have not been answered as yet, but we are actively engaging with these issues. As the Fair Finance Coalition Southern Africa, we are engaging with our public finance institutions to say, please provide us with information relating to your role in the JETP. It is of the utmost importance that we understand loan amounts, loan conditions, levels of concessionality, not just because this particular JETP is important for South Africa, but also because it is a precedent for JETPs around the world. And so to the extent that there are particular failings or oversights, as civil society, we can help. We can be part of the solution in being able to critique the approach that public finance institutions are taking in relation to a JETP. We remain in support of a just energy transition in South Africa, and we certainly hope that we can contribute to it being a success. Thank you.
So the JETP that Lian is speaking about in the video has recently progressed with the South African president releasing the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan here at COP27. And now I would like to introduce Glen Tyler-Davies, South African team lead for 350africa.org, another member organization of the Fair Finance Coalition, to tell us more about the Fair Finance Network and the coalition in South Africa.
Thank you very much, Marcelo, and thank you all for being here. Good afternoon. I'm going to be, one word is that The French translation is on channel 1, not channel 2. So if you're listening to the French, it's on channel 1, not channel 2. I'm going to be introducing the Fair Finance Network. The Fair Finance Coalition Southern Africa is part of the Fair Finance International Network, a network of 15 coalitions in 15 countries. They started with bank guides, in particular, ranking banks, and have now expanded to insurance guides and pension guides. Through our work, we've reached 35 million people, and we've seen over 1,000 improvements of financial institutions' policies and practices. We've campaigned with 130 case studies, and through our work, the policies of over 200 financial institutions have been assessed on at least 9 common themes using a common, robust methodology. In Southern Africa, the coalition is made up of 7 organizations, and we're privileged to have 4 of them represented here today. They are the African Climate Reality Project, my own organization, 350africa.org, the Center for Environmental Rights, EarthLife Africa, Oxfam South Africa, the Center for Applied Legal Studies, and Justice Ambiental from Mozambique. We work on social media using the hashtag FairFinanceSA, so you're welcome to use that today as well. To talk a little bit about the activities of the network and of the coalition, our core focus is policy assessments, and we completed the first policy assessment in Southern Africa in 2020. We're launching the second policy assessment here today. We also produce case studies, and these really illustrate the policy assessment by shining the light on implementation by financial institutions. We also engage with the financial institutions that we work with through meetings, and one thing I'd like to mention in particular is the Fair Finance School, a project that will launch in early 2023, where we will invite the public finance institutions that we have assessed in this assessment and report to work with us, to meet with us, to learn from us, and to work together to improve the work that they do, the policies that they have through the policy assessment. Lastly, I'd like to talk a little bit about some principles of climate finance that we have developed. In October of this year, last month, we convened a town hall. This was to do with the JETP, the Just Energy Transition Partnership that Leanne spoke about in the video. We wanted to make sure that civil society's voices were included in this conversation. And obviously, because the JETP will involve public finance institutions, we wanted to make sure that this was a core part of our work as well. As I say, we convened a town hall in Johannesburg last month. We brought together civil society, labor, environmental organizations, and social justice organizations, and spoke about these principles of climate finance. They're up on the screen briefly, but we're also playing a video of them at the start of the event, and we will play it again at the end of the event, which goes into the principles in a bit more detail. And we'd really appreciate any feedback you have on these principles. We have workshopped them with civil society in South Africa, and we'd like to continue doing that. We'll be asking, well, one of the reasons for the event today is to get your feedback and your questions on the policy assessment. So we'd love for you to engage with us on Twitter. You can use the hashtag FairFinanceSA, and we will respond to you there. If you're not on Twitter or you're struggling with the reception, as all of us here at COP27 I think are, you're also able to just write something on a piece of paper, and my colleague will hand out some pieces of paper to you, and we'll collect those from you at the end as well. If you have any questions, feedback, comments for us, we'd really appreciate it. So with that, I'm going to hand back to Marcelo. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Glen. We're now going to turn to the primary reason for this event, the launch of the 2022 Financing Fairly Report and Policy Assessment. Amy Giliam Thorp and Zahra Omar will summarize the findings. Amy is the branch manager of the African Climate Reality Project. and Zahra is an attorney in the Corporate Accountability and Transparency Program at the Center for Environmental Rights.
Thank you, Marcelo, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us to launch the Fair Finance Coalition Southern Africa's policy assessment report titled Financing Fairly, Are Public Finance Institutions in Southern Africa Financing the Climate Crisis? So just to start off with some context about why this report is particularly important, as we've heard over the last few days, and as many of you know in this room, the climate crisis is already here, and we are feeling its impacts, especially in the African context, from deadly floods in Nigeria and South Africa earlier this year to devastating droughts in Somalia. African countries have faced a series of severe, unprecedented extreme weather events, killing over 4,000 people and affecting a further 19 million people since the start of 2022. These events are a constant, sobering reminder that the continent is disproportionately affected by the climate crisis, and that we're warming faster than the global average and have been over the last few decades and will continue to do so. In fact, Southern Africa's temperatures are expected to be 4 degrees above normal if warming exceeds the 2-degree limit. And so for those reasons, along with many others, finance that is fair for people and for planets is absolutely necessary and urgent in the African context. The problem is that power generation in Africa is still dominated by fossil fuels. Despite the increasing evidence of the continent's vulnerability to climate impacts, financing and investments in new fossil fuels have not stopped. In fact, they have continued unabated. A 2022 Bank Track report released earlier this year found that between 2016 and the end of June 2021, 782 fossil fuel projects are either in operation or under construction across East, West, Central, and Southern Africa. And of those projects, 418 are situated in Southern Africa. So with the region warming at a faster rate and increasing extreme weather events from Cyclone Idai to the recent floods in Nigeria and South Africa, continued investments in fossil fuels is unacceptable, and a just transition to renewable energy is really now non-negotiable. But before we move into the policy assessment, what we did and how we did it and why we did it, it's important to unpack and understand what we mean when we talk about public finance institutions. So we're referring to development banks, trust companies, insurance companies, and asset managers that are owned and controlled by the state or government. And they provide capital for major infrastructure and development projects. But what's really important to take away from here is that they have specific developmental mandates in the countries or regions in which they operate. So in other words, a developmental mandate means that public finance institutions have an important role and obligation to finance a just and equitable society where the link between people and nature is valued and protected. Just as an example, one of the public finance institutions that we assessed, the Public Investment Corporation, the money that it receives from one of its biggest clients, which so happens to be the South African government Employees Pension Fund, is being used to finance and invest in fossil fuels. So public finance institutions, the main financiers behind development in our countries and our region, are still financing fossil fuels. And in doing so, they're directly undermining sustainable development and locking the region and our countries into fossil fuel dependency. So in that context, we have to ask, what do we mean by development? And can we really call it development if it still involves fossil fuels? What is the responsibility of these institutions and how do we hold them accountable? I'm going to pause here and ask Glen if he can play a short video from Profundo describing the research process and methodology that we used for the report.
Hello everybody, I am Yurani Ramirez. I'm a researcher on sustainability policies of financial institutions at Profundo, and I will tell you today about the Fair Finance Guide International methodology and how it was applied in this policy assessment of 6 public financial institutions operating in Southern Africa. The methodology was developed by the Fair Finance International Network with research experts from Profundo in 2014. The methodology is meant to verify which sustainability issues play a role in the policies that financial institutions apply when assessing credit requests and selecting investments. This methodology is updated every 2 years. The latest version is from 2021. In full, the methodology covers 23 influential sustainability themes that have been identified by the network as the most relevant. So it includes themes like climate change, corruption, and human rights. The methodology describes what is at stake in each theme, what are the main international standards and initiatives addressing the theme, and provides a list of assessment elements. The process of assessment is transparent. That means that all the financial institutions are informed of the policy assessment, its process, and timelines. And all the financial institutions receive a draft of the policy assessment tool in which they can provide feedback. Previous to starting the process, the financial institutions are informed that only publicly available information, such as annual and sustainability reports, codes of conduct, press releases, and content of the web page qualifies for the assessment. For this assessment, the 6 public financial institutions were notified that only publications before March would be taken into account. The assessment follows a scoring system that results in a score that ranges from 0 for very poor policies to 10 for excellent policies. I will tell you more about this in the next slide. It is important to clarify that the assessment is about the policies and not about the actual implementation of the policies. You can find the full Fair Finance Guide International methodology available online on the webpage of the Fair Finance Guide. The scoring system is relatively simple. The policy elements provided by the Fair Finance Guide are seen as criteria for a good policy. For each criterion included in the policies of a financial institution, a content score of 1 is assigned. As an illustration, if a theme has 12 elements and all the elements are found in the content of the policy of a financial institution, then that financial institution would score 12. However, the scoring process does not end there. The content score in each element is then multiplied by a scope score that is expressed as a percentage based on the coverage of 4 credit or investment categories, so 4 scopes. And these scopes are corporate credits, project finance, equity investment, and proprietary assets. This means that the content of a policy should clarify what is the scope of its application. For example, some policies may apply only to project finance and others only to proprietary assets. There are then different possible scores for each element depending on the combination of content and scope. If anybody is interested in more details about the possibilities for scores, you will find this information in the report and also in the Fair Finance Guide methodology. To finish, all the elements add up to a total. The total is then normalized and rated on a scale from 0 to 10. Remember that 0 means poor policies and 10 excellent policies. The policy assessments for the public financial institutions in Southern Africa were conducted between April and July of 2022. All the public financial institutions were notified of the policy assessment and received a draft of the policy assessment tool to provide comments. Only one public financial institution, the Development Bank of Southern Africa, provided feedback within the timelines. Unfortunately, the African Development Bank provided feedback way past the deadline, and we couldn't incorporate that feedback into this report. The 6 public financial institutions assessed were the African Development Bank, the Development Bank of Southern Africa, the Export Credit Insurance Corporation, the Industrial Development Corporation, the New Development Bank, and the Public Investment Corporation. And this policy assessment in particular looked at 8 sustainability themes only: climate change, corruption, gender equality, human rights, labor rights, nature, power generation, transparency, and accountability. If you want to know more about the methodology of this policy assessment, you can find this information in the report, and you can find even more details of the Fair Finance Guide methodology in the webpage of the Fair Finance Guide. Thank you very much.
So, as the video mentioned, at the beginning of this year, the Fair Finance Coalition of Southern Africa undertook a policy assessment of 6 financial institutions in Southern Africa across 8 different themes. What you see on the slide are the 6 different financial institutions that were assessed. We have one development finance institution that's state-owned by the South African government. Another one also state-owned by the South African government, a multilateral development bank, a regional development bank, one South African public asset manager, and one South African national export credit agency. But the common denominator here is that they're all public finance institutions. And the main purpose of doing this policy assessment is firstly to evaluate the extent to which the policies of these financial institutions comply with international standards and best practices, and secondly, to use the findings of this policy assessment to open up dialogue between us as civil society organizations and the public finance institutions. So as mentioned, the policy assessment was conducted across 8 themes, and although these 8 themes are all interlinked and overlap with each other, because of the particular work of the member organizations of the Fair Finance Coalition, our report focuses only on the climate change theme, power generation, and transparency and accountability. Before we go into those findings, I think it's important to reiterate that this was a policy assessment only. In other words, it doesn't assess the implementation of these policies by the banks. The implementation is assessed in other projects of the Fair Finance Coalition. Also, I think it's important to mention that only publicly available policies of the banks were assessed, and only policies that were available before March of this year. So going into the findings, I'll start off with the theme of climate change. I think it goes without saying why this theme is so important, but let me explain exactly what this theme assesses with regards to banks' policies. So some of the standards against which the bank's policies were assessed under the climate change theme is, for example, to what extent do these PFIs proactively address climate change through measuring and reporting their carbon footprint of their financial portfolios and through presenting strategies or policies to ensure their portfolios are consistent with the 1.5-degree Paris Agreement target. Secondly, do these PFIs have adequate strategies to guide the transition to a low-carbon economy, including a shift from fossil fuels to renewable energy? And thirdly, do their publicly available policies explicitly indicate how they, and equally the companies they finance or invest in, intend to measure, disclose, and phase out activities with high greenhouse gas emissions? So how did the bank score on this theme? The climate change theme received the lowest scores out of all 8 themes, with the DBSA receiving the highest score of only 2.2 out of 10, and the PIC with the lowest score of 0. The reason for the poor scores is that none of the PFIs measure or disclose their greenhouse gas emissions associated with their credit and investment portfolios. None of the PFIs measure and disclose climate-related impacts in line with the recommendations of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. None of the PFIs disclose any plans or policies to phase out fossil fuel financing or investment, and none of the PFIs set any limits or conditions for their financing or investment in fossil fuel, power generation, mining, or extraction. So where do the few scores come from? For large-scale financing, all of the PFIs except for the PIC make environmental impact assessments that include data on greenhouse gas emissions and climate risks, and all of the PFIs except for the PIC and the ECIC have publicly available policies that address environmental and social standards. So moving on to the theme of power generation. This theme is particularly important because power generation and distribution are essential for ensuring equal access to meet Africa's energy needs. A primary concern related to power generation is its contribution to climate change, with burning fossil fuels accounting for more than 70% of all global emissions. Climate scientists and the International Energy Agency agree that a substantial shift in investment in fossil fuels to renewable energy is needed to meet climate goals. So essentially this theme assesses whether the PFIs are ensuring that the transition to a lower carbon economy is financed by making significant investments in renewable energy projects, by having targets to reduce financing in fossil fuels, and ensuring that the projects don't impact adversely on human rights, biodiversity, or wildlife. So how did the PFI score under power generation? So the scores under power generation are ranged from a low of 0.5 for the IDC to an average of 5.5 for the AFDB. A few of the standards under this theme overlap with the climate change theme, which explains the high scores for the DBSA and the AFDB, which were both also the highest contenders under climate change. However, the scores here are still relatively low. This is primarily because none of the PFIs disclose any plan or policy to phase out finance for fossil fuel-fired power generation, and none of the PFIs have exclusion policies for unabated coal-fired power generation, or even at a minimum state that it is unacceptable or undesirable. So where do the scores come from? All of the PFIs except for the ECIC claim to be financing renewable energy projects. And secondly, all of the PFIs except for the IDC and the ECIC require the companies they finance and invest in to have processes to enable remediation of any adverse human impacts which they cause or which they contribute to. So from those two key themes of climate change and power generation, we can conclude that yes, PFIs are financing renewable energy projects, but they aren't simultaneously shifting away from fossil fuel financing. Now, when it comes to the South African PFIs, being the DBSA, the IDC, the PIC, and the ECIC, there are two considerations that need to be taken into account when looking at the findings of this policy assessment. The first is South Africa's public policy. Being state-owned institutions, these PFIs are required to operate in line with public mandate and public policy, and this may influence their decision-making and their policies. While South Africa's National Development Plan does promote the transition to a low-carbon economy, we see that South Africa's Integrated Resources Plan, which is our national electricity plan, still makes provision for new coal-based electricity in the country's energy mix. So while, for example, the DBSA scores quite highly on power generation because of its financing of renewable energy projects, it scores low on climate change because it has not yet excluded fossil fuels from its financing portfolio. In South Africa, mining continues to be seen as the primary driver of the economy, with coal as a vital export and the main source for energy in our country. And as we have seen it play out, this minerals energy complex continues to be a barrier to sustainable development. So a key challenge to policy formulation for South African PFIs is this political influence. But PFIs can't be selective about the policies they wish to follow. PFIs should be aligning their policies with South Africa's National Development Plan, with the Sustainable Development Goals, with the nationally determined contribution, and with South Africa's sustainability objectives and international commitments. In fact, first and foremost, these PFIs should be aligning their policies with their missions and visions, all of which state that they promote sustainable development. And then a second contextual consideration to take into account is the current coal export market. So among all the talks of coal phase-outs and transitioning into a low-carbon economy, the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the consequent ban on Russian coal imports has led European countries to seek an alternative, purchasing more coal from South Africa. In June this year, it was reported that Europe had imported more than 40% more coal from South Africa in the first 5 months of this year than the entire of last year. So Europe's scramble for coal can also explain why South Africa is still financing new coal mining. But a key concern here is that while Europe is providing South Africa with climate finance, at the same time they are still purchasing our coal. I'll now hand over to Amy to talk about transparency and accountability.
Thank you, Zahra. So an important consideration to keep in mind when thinking about transparency and accountability, particularly when it comes to proposed projects, is that everyone has the right to know how the developments will impact their fundamental rights and any alternatives to those development projects. And importantly, everyone must be able to access all relevant information in order to protect their rights and livelihoods. So this theme assesses the extent to which public finance institutions are integrating transparency and accountability into their policies, and not only in terms of their internal policies, but also with the companies they finance and invest in. For instance, it looks at whether public finance institutions publish the names of governments and companies they invest in or exclude due to sustainability issues, whether they provide detailed breakdowns of their portfolios, and whether they participate in or set up grievance mechanisms for individuals and communities affected by the projects they're financing. And as this quote suggests, without transparency, there cannot be accountability. And so again, on this theme, we see that across the board, all public finance institutions perform poorly, with the IDC receiving the lowest score of 0.9 to NDB receiving the highest score of 4.3. So why do the banks score poorly under transparency and accountability? Well, one of the reasons is that 3 of them, the IDC, PIC, and ECIC, have little to no disclosure of their lending and investment policies. Secondly, 4 of the public finance institutions that we assessed, the ECIC, IDC, NDB, and PIC, do not disclose a complaint or grievance mechanism that is open to communities and individuals impacted by activities of the companies that they finance and invest in. And then finally, across the board, all public finance institutions lack a very clear policy on how they handle interactions and engagements with companies and clients when social and environmental issues or controversies arise, let alone the topics of those interactions. So where do their scores come from? Well, public finance institutions' scores are boosted in this theme where they do disclose their social and environmental frameworks, and that's the case for most of them, apart from the Export Credit Insurance Corporation, ECIC. But the level of detail and the scope of application across those frameworks tends to vary, and importantly, none of them are audited by an external third party. And then the NDB, the AFDB, and DBSA receive higher points because they do disclose some of the names of projects, companies, and government bonds that they are involved in through their investments. But again, while that's a step in the right direction, their policies here could improve by consistently disclosing all names of their clients and details of the sectors being financed. And then, as we mentioned earlier, this policy assessment looked at and assessed the public finance institutions in terms of 5 other themes, ranging from gender equality, corruption, human rights, nature, and labor rights, given how they are cross-cutting and their relevancy to the climate crisis. But since they were not the main focus of our report, I'm only going to briefly highlight some of the key similarities and also concerns in relation to the human rights theme, and invite you to read more about the rest in our report. So as we know, fossil fuel extraction projects across much of Africa and equally elsewhere in the world are linked to human rights violations. And as you will see here, 4 of the public finance institutions received below 5 points, whereas only the African Development Bank and the Development Bank of Southern Africa receive higher points for integrating human rights policies into their social and environmental frameworks. But again, all public finance institutions across the board need to expand their policies here, specifically to safeguard human rights by including free, prior, and informed consent of communities. And then what's really important is that they need to pay attention to wording. So for example, a major gap exists in the African Development Bank's policies due to the current wording, which uses consultation rather than consent. And so what this means is that the African Development Bank can consult with communities affected by their projects without receiving their consent. I'll hand back over to Zahra.
Thanks, Amy. So the policy assessment findings are not all doom and gloom. There are some positive initial steps taken by the 6 PFIs, including in the form of public statements, intentions to publish net zero action plans, and to provide climate finance. But a lot of work is still to be done here. So if you look at the table, the DBSA has an approved integrated just transition investment framework since 2020. However, this framework is still not publicly available. If you look at the PIC, they published an invitation for a service provider to assist with formulating a net zero action plan at the end of 2021. We still haven't seen this net zero action plan. If you look at the NDB, they provided climate finance for the just transition in South Africa. However, 2 of the countries that are part of the NDB, founding countries, China and India, continue to export coal from South Africa. If you look at the AFDB, they made a public announcement as far back as 2019 with their intention to get out of coal, but still fossil fuels forms part of their financing portfolio. So while these statements and intentions are great, we want to see more. We want to see concrete plans and policies. We also recognize the COP27 Multilateral Development Bank statement that was published just this week, and which the NDB and the AFDB signed onto, and which states that they are on track to ensuring their commitments with the Paris Agreement target. However, our policy assessment findings do show otherwise.
So what next for these public finance institutions? Well, drawing from the findings of this policy assessment, the Fair Finance Coalition of Southern Africa has identified 6 recommendations for them to adopt. And these include establishing a fossil fuel finance exclusion policy or plan with very clear timelines and targets for an equitable phase out of fossil fuel financing and investments. Secondly, it's to align their policies with the 1.5-degree Paris Agreement targets by establishing and disclosing measurable targets to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in their internal operations, their finance and investment portfolios, and also to make meaningful commitments to meeting those targets. And then thirdly, it's to improve the level of disclosure and sustainability of their policies across the 8 themes of this policy assessment. The 4th recommendation is to use the Fair Finance Guide methodology for policy guidance on the latest international standards and expectations of better sustainability practices.
And then the last 2 recommendations we have is for PFIs to disclose the scope and content both of their current and their future policies. And lastly, to engage and consult with the Fair Finance Coalition of Southern Africa in order to understand our expectations and to improve their policies on social and environmental responsibilities. So to end off, governments and state-owned institutions like these PFIs are stewards and not owners of public funds. So they ought to strive for the highest standards of transparency and accountability. We must hold them accountable for their actions or the lack thereof. For decades, we've had a disproportionate focus on economic growth at the expense of our environment and at the expense of the future of our planet and our people. The time to make a change was yesterday, but the second best time is now. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy, and thank you, Zahra, for your presentations. And thank you for highlighting the findings, and especially the findings on other themes, important themes such as human rights, nature, gender, and others. And also for bringing these 6 very clear and straightforward recommendations. We will now hear 3 responses to the report from 3 different people. Safira Patel, Head of the Environmental and Social Sustainability Unit at the Development Bank of Southern Africa. We will then hear Lucy Duba, activist from Lefalale, South Africa, where the Medupi coal-fired power station is situated. And then Dr. Ahmed Hussein, Director of the Eco-Industrial Department in Chemonics Egypt Consultants, Associate Professor at Cairo University and an Adjunct Professor at the University of Toronto in the field of energy systems and electric power. And we would like to mention that we received a video today, just before the event, from the IDC, Industrial Development Corporation, South Africa. But unfortunately, due to the poor network, we have been unable to download it, and we'll find another way to share it in our platforms. And before I hand over to Safira, I would like to mention that the Fair Finance Coalition would like to acknowledge how important your participation here is today, representing PFIs, and that this is a first step for a very important dialogue. Over to you, Safira.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting us, the DBSA, to the launch and also to participate in the discussion. I think it's very important for us to all work together as a partnership and ensure that we do walk the journey together along the just transition towards a low carbon, resilient and inclusive economy. I think that's the direction we all need to go in, and it's really great to be able to work with partners such as yourself. So with respect to the report, we do welcome the report. We welcome it for a variety of reasons. The first being that we did better than last year, which I was quite happy about. I think it's an indication that we've got systems in place. They're getting better every day. We're working on them, and it's not that we're stagnating or not wanting to move along. So I was quite excited about that one when we saw the report. I think, secondly, the issue is that being part of this dialogue enables us to get better and better in everything we do. And as a result, this interaction is only going to mean that in the future we will get better. So that's the perspective that we are taking on the report, and we do welcome it and future such reports. The one aspect that I think maybe would be issue, and it has been touched on by colleagues here, is the issue that it was a report that was based on publicly available policies. And that doesn't give us a comprehensive view of what the DBSA is doing, how we're doing it, and what we're doing in the background to try and get better every day. As I mentioned, between last year and this year, or the 2020 and 2021 report, there was a marked increase in what we scored, and that's something is a very good thing for us. So just examples of what we are doing in the background that's going to be critically important for maybe next year, for the next publication, is that we do actually have a climate change policy in place. We just haven't published it. We do also have our just energy transition plan in place. We haven't published it. So I think one thing that this highlights is that we just are doing things that I think the public, the stakeholders would like to see. It's just not getting out there. So it's something to do with our dissemination and how we interact with our stakeholders. And that's something that's not very difficult to overcome. That's something we can do, and that should help us going forward. I think additionally, it's important to note that some of the documents that we would have used or shown in this discussion, if it wasn't just based on publicly available policies, would have been aspects like the fact that we're currently in the process of revising our environmental and social management systems, the associated safeguards that go with it, the templates, guidelines, how we're going to be undertaking our DDs. And the reason we're doing this revision, I think it's particularly important because as we walk this journey towards a just transition, we need to make sure that internally all our systems are in place and aligned to support the just transition. It's one thing having a statement saying we're not going to do something without having the internal infrastructure to be able to deliver on that. So as we speak, we are undertaking quite a big review and update of our ESMS. And key elements of that are aspects such as how are we going to review our clients' just transition plans. In our fossil fuels funding statement, we have stated that we will not be funding any fossil fuels in the future unless they're part of a credible and unambiguous just transition plan. And that is a big thing because we have to look at what our clients are doing and help them along and guide them along the path as well. So from a more constructive perspective, that's critically important. And what that has also shown us is that many other partners and clients also don't have just transition plans in place or haven't published them either. So as much as a work in progress it is for us in developing our just transition plan, it's also an opportunity to share and build with our partners and ensure that they've got credible and unambiguous just transition plans in place. And we are working towards supporting our clients in that process. I think lastly, maybe one thing is that another reason a lot of our frameworks and guidelines aren't in the public domain is they're more internal documents that guide how we function. And there is the opportunity for somebody to look at something that, is an internal document that we kind of understand because it's an animal that we work with every day. And you could put something out there that people who don't fully understand the internal workings of an organization such as DBSA, because of the jargon, because of the funny ways, we all work, it could also cause or misrepresent a lot of the work that we're doing. So I think the distinction needs to be made between what's happening internally, what's being, the measures that are being taken to better, and to make sure that next year when we do this, we're going to have an even better score. Is something I'm definitely looking forward to, and we've put a lot of effort into doing that. I think lastly, one of the most important elements of this, and we found it working with other partners and other stakeholders as well, is that when we do these studies or reviews, it does show you where your gaps are. And one has to not be blind to what your problems or your gaps may be. For example, we were accredited by the GCF and the GEF, and they do quite a heavy review of your internal processes, of what you do, of how you fund, or how, what you don't do, where you need to better. And that was one of the key, shall we say, triggers in ensuring that we better start putting in place the right systems that are, for example, our integrated grievance redress mechanism. We have it in place. We recently had a review with Jeff, and they've mentioned that it's not as robust as they'd like it to be, so we revised it. So it's about partnerships and working together and helping each other along. So we do believe that these gaps are only going to help us get better. And lastly, the opportunity like this, it's really good, it's amazing, it's great, because this enables us to get better, not just with the Fair Finance Coalition. We have various stakeholders and shareholders that all need to be brought along and worked with, and who can not just work with us, but inform how we do things and how we put systems in place. So from that perspective, we really do welcome this discussion and the partnership. Maybe just lastly to note that we did have a meeting last week with the Fair Finance Coalition, and it was a very fruitful meeting, and it did enable us to start identifying how we can do better things and also commit to these partnerships with Fair Finance and other civil and public stakeholders. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Zahra, for sharing more with us about this work in progress and the meeting. And once again, thank you for engaging in this dialogue. And now we will hear Lucy.
Thank you very much for inviting me. My name is Lucy Doba from Lephalale, South Africa, in Limpopo province, where Medupi is being built. When I see this board written the names of the banks, I nearly cried because of when I see those names, I saw problems because they're the one that brought problems to our lives. When Medupi came to our place, the politicians and the banks, they were telling us that this is the big development that is gonna change our lives. We were so happy because we are poor. We were so happy because of we are not working. We thought that our lives will change for the better, only to find out that is the beginning of our problems. During 2010, the late Minister Edna Molewa of Environmental Affairs, she declared Lephalale as a priority area in case of air pollution. Despite that, because of people were hungry for jobs, they continue building Medupi. And when they built Medupi, they promised that they will install technology that will minimize the emission, not to affect people. But it's 11 years to 12 years down the line. We are suffering the pollution. There is no technology. Even the bank or the government can't come to us as the affected people to tell us what happened to the technology, because we have been waiting for it and we are dying. We are really very, very bad affected. As you can look at me, when I see lights, my eyes is so painful. Last week, I was away from home. I was being called from school, come and take your child because of she's been affected. Her eyes can't see. It's very bad. Living in Lephalale is like living in hell. And I'm wondering if this institution is going to continue to finance these fossil fuels that comes to our area, because we really don't need this fossil fuel industries in our area. We need projects that will empower people, projects that will not affect us, even our environment, in a very bad way. We have been taken for right. Our rights have been compromised. We inhale dirty air every day, and no one is doing anything about it. We have had enough. We want to say to the government, to the DBSA and other banks, please, please, our life matters. We have had enough. Let our voices be heard as women, because we are mostly affected. Why I say women are mostly affected? When the child is sick, they can't call the father, they'll call the mother. If there is no water in home, the woman is the one who must go out and fetch water. If there is no electricity, you know, everything is on the woman's shoulder. So that is why I say we are really affected as women. And this thing of fossil fuels, guys, we are done. We want renewables, something that will be inclusive. No one must be left behind. That's my last message. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lucy, for sharing this with us. And it's so important to ground this sort of work in people's lived experience, and particularly the experience of the communities who are most affected, and within these communities, the groups who are most affected, like women. So thank you very much for sharing here. And before I pass on to Dr. Ahmed, who will speak about projects which include local communities, I would like to bring an example of a local climate finance solution from Brazil, the country I come from. So the Podali Fund is a fund which was established by indigenous peoples in Brazil. And for this fund, the governance is exclusively composed of indigenous representatives. All processes are transparent, and all projects are supported and run by indigenous peoples themselves. The fund is supported by international donors. And funds like Podali in Brazil or elsewhere can play an important role channeling funds to local communities to let them determine their own climate agendas and strategies for their territories. And we will now hear Dr. Ahmed.
So I just thought actually now to try to make my contribution as tangible as possible as examples of climate finance and their challenges. First of all, I have to say that I really think it's such a difficult task for public finance institution to try to meet all these targets. We have to remember that at the end they are finance institutions, and their raison d'etre or main objective or a core part of their operation is to develop successful loans. If this is jeopardized, then we are in a problem. But the idea is that maybe through policies we can find the room where we can deliver successful, profitable finance projects with big market impact, but also good climate impact. I'll give you two stories of two farmers, and the difference between the stories is a success case that I will mention at the end. I'll take farmers because I think funding or helping farmers in Africa to become more climate resilient will not only shed or achieve GHG targets, but it hits on every developmental aspect. So this farmer in Egypt, let's say, if they can get a loan for a solar pump, their costs will go down by 30%. This extra money immediately means better productivity, better income to the family. The farmer doesn't know what a solar pump is, doesn't know where to buy it from. Assume they know, they go to the public finance institution local branch. To be frank, if I am the officer in this branch, in the current policy frame, I will go away from this. Because first of all, I have to look at the risk of lending the farmer. It's probably not bankable. How I'm gonna assess their financial risk. Now I have the burden of the risk of this new technology. Is there a proper technology provider? How I'm gonna define the cost? This means I will take 6 months to process this case, and at the end I will not deliver on my targets. I will have less loans delivered, less finance delivered. All these challenges are policy challenges. They are not someone's fault. Now let's take something. I have had the chance to work on helping financial institutions develop tailored financial products that can really address this by overcoming certain finance barriers. Now the story of the other farmer, and I refer to something that we have done with the Agriculture Bank of Egypt, also as well with the Micro and Small Enterprises Development Agency in Egypt. Now in the other scenario, in this tailored financial product, the bank is going with the company to promote the idea to the farmer. The credit officer has a risk scoring that can allow them to look at risk beyond collateral. Look at what crops this farmer is using. Look at what technology provider is going to give the solution. They have an Excel tool that tells them if the pricing is correct. They have a special agreement with the technology provider to help the farmer fill the application in 5 minutes. The result was, this is a product that was launched by the Agriculture Bank of Egypt, and the result was in their first assessment after 3 or 6 months, 200 loans, and now it's progressing with 0 non-performing loans ratio. So what is happening on the ground that it is challenging, it is very rewarding, but we need to look at it differently. The public finance institution, to be able to capture the opportunity in fair finance and in climate finance, they have to play a new role. They have to coordinate with the technology providers. They have to they have to play it proactively. They have to do tailored financial products. They have to develop the market somehow. I know this looks like a burden, but if I tell you that the Agriculture Bank of Egypt, before, when they used to try to fund solar pumps through the regular mode of operation, it took 8 to 9 months. Now it takes 3 to 4 days. The next stage is to digitalize it. So what I want to say is that there is huge market opportunity. For the bank, this is an uncharted 1 million loans in Egypt with $4 billion. This is double as big as the Bimban Solar Park, which is the biggest in Egypt, in the world. So what I want to say is that there is a huge chance huge market opportunity to capture, but we need to look at it differently. From a policy perspective, we don't need to look at GHG as a post-implementation. How many GHG emissions I have saved. I need to proactively decide I'm going to open certain markets where I will achieve this. I need the market intelligence and visibility. We need tailored products. We need to look at risk in a different manner, using market indicators. Which type of crop is there? Which type of technology is there? I can bet you that through these frames, new risk frames, someone that looks non-bankable using the traditional frame can be the most trustworthy borrowers. I know it takes time, so it takes you time to develop this frame. But once it is there, I think you can achieve both on climate and on financial indicators, non-performing loans, a lot of successful cases. I'll stop here, but it's not an easy task, but it's doable, I think. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Ahmed. It's great to hear about these innovative projects that are responding to the climate crisis. And thank you also for shedding some light on these new roles to be played by PFIs and opportunities and the importance of digital inclusion and digital projects. Thank you. And at this point, Glen is going to lead us into the questions and answer session with a quick exercise to understand better who is in the room today.
Thanks, Marcelo, and thank you to all the panelists. We wanted to, instead of just opening up the Q&A, just get a bit of a sense of who is in the room with us today. So we'd like to ask you both for the sector that you're from and the region that you're from globally. So I'm going to list a number of sectors, 5 sectors. Choose the one which most fits yours, and then I'll ask you to put up your hand when I list them. So the 5 sectors are CSOs and NGOs, financial institutions, business, government, and media. So if you're a representative of a CSO or an NGO, could you put up your hand? Thanks very much. If you represent a financial institution, could you put up your hand? Thank you. Business people representing business. Thank you very much. And government, are there any government representatives here? One there, thank you. And lastly, media. A couple of media people, thanks. Doing the same for regions again, and feel free to look around and get a sense of who's around you in the room as well. People from Africa, hands up. Fantastic, thank you. South America, a couple. North America, thanks very much. Europe, Asia, thank you. India and Southeast Asia, some people might put up their hand twice there. Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific. Okay, thanks. Just to get us an idea of who's in the room with us, and we're now going to go into a question and answer session, and Marcelo will lead us through that. But just to say that there is another opportunity to interact with us. If you don't have an opportunity to ask a question live, you can send us questions, comments, feedbacks on Twitter using the hashtag FairFinanceSA. And there are also some pieces of paper that you're welcome just to write a question, any feedback or a comment that you may have, and you can give them back to us at the end of the event. We'll take those into account. Maybe if you would like a response, just to include your contact details on that, that would be helpful. And we'll also be able to interact with you in that way. Thanks, Marcelo.
Well, thank you, Glen. We'll now take a set of 3 questions. There are 2 roving microphones in the room. So please raise your hand if you like to ask a question, and we'll bring one to you. So just 3 points to keep in mind for the question. Please keep your question to a maximum of 1 minute. The shorter, the better. Please introduce yourself, name and affiliation when asking a question. And please indicate if your question is directed to a specific panelist. Thank you.
So I'm John Facemeyer. I'm with a group called Nuclear for Climate. I was looking at the report and the power generation score, and I was wondering if grid reliability played into it at all, because blackouts have been such a big issue in South Africa this year.
Would you like anyone to answer your question? Anyone specific? Yeah, Amy or Zahra? Yes, could you please repeat the question? And we're not hearing very well the microphone, so if you could speak louder, we would appreciate it. Thank you.
So can you hear me now? The question was if grid reliability played into the generation part of the report at all, given the blackouts that happened in South Africa over the past years.
So in short, no, the assessment doesn't take into account grid reliability.
We have a question at the front. Yes.
Thank you. Ethan Spanner from the Global Climate Reality Project, not the African one. My question is for Ms. Patel. You mentioned a lot about the internal documents that do show a more progressive set of policies that unfortunately weren't able to make it into this policy assessment or theoretically into any other CSO assessment. My question is how the bank might be looking into engaging CSOs or taking on a responsibility to make those documents more accessible to the public, both in content and in availability.
My name is Sunny Morgan. I'm a climate justice activist from South Africa. My question is directed at Ms. Patel. I'm wondering if the Development Bank of Southern Africa is making any provisions, contingent liability provisions for claims, climate claims that will be coming for its support of the fossil fuel industry in South Africa and elsewhere. Obviously, this is a liability that's going to only increase and even threaten the viability of the bank. As climate activists, we have protested regularly at the bank, calling for the bank to stop financing fossil fuels, but we don't see any progress on that. Our next step of action is to start to sue the bank for climate damage.
I think we have enough questions maybe to be answered, and then we get another one if there's time. Okay.
Thank you for those questions. I'm going to start with, the issue of the internal documents and what we are doing to try and disseminate information and share information with CSOs. So let's start with the fact that we had started a process of working with and having workshops with CSOs, and we were planning on doing those on a more regular basis. We started, I think it was the end of 2019 or early 2020. Unfortunately, after our first one, we had COVID, and that changed a great deal of things. I think we're all aware of that and how we function and what we're doing, and we're kind of trying to catch up from the post-COVID hangover. And we, in our discussions last week with Fair Finance, we did give a commitment that we're going to start those again. We had our chairman of the board there and our company secretary, and the commitment is from a very high level that we will be doing more CSO engagements at the bank or workshops where we will discuss how better to fix our processes and our systems, but also how better to interact and work with CSOs and various other public stakeholders and shareholders. And so that's a first. We think we committed to something like quarterly, but we still have to, figure out exactly how we're going to go about doing that. With respect to making documents more accessible, I think that the important thing of the study was that we do have documents. Not all of them are out there in the public domain. We're revising our Just Energy Transition paper. We're revising our climate change paper. And part of that revision and putting together our Just Transition plan policy with targets, part of it is the interactions with civil society, the governance, the evidence of showing the move along the pathway that will enable us to get to the inclusive just transition that we're all looking for. So that is a key component of the development of our Just Transition plan, and in the discussions that we will be having with our CSOs, how to interact, how to share, what sort of information is being looked for would be part of that process. So that is one of the key elements that we're working on. I think maybe lastly on that topic, it's important to note that we are now also actively looking through those documents that we already have available that aren't currently being reviewed or revised and can go up onto our website as soon as possible. And I think it's important that we try and do that as soon as possible. So we are working on that quite intensively. With respect to the gentleman's question on provisions for climate claims and climate risk and vulnerability and what we are doing internally as the DBSA, what I can say is we've recently started reviewing our portfolio, specifically to better understand the proportion of our portfolio that is fossil fuel intensive, the portion that isn't, how we're going to deal with that portfolio with respect to stranded assets, and specifically climate risk and vulnerability. So we have started doing that. We're trying to work on that because we do recognize the impact of having a fossil fuel heavy portfolio. We wouldn't want to have our portfolio which is entirely based there, and we are trying to transition, and we have shown change in the way our book looks and the proportion of our book that sits in fossil fuel intensive or fossil fuels and the greener part of our book. So that move, I think, is happening. It's very important for us on our journey of the towards the just transition, towards net zero, because we don't know where we are. We don't know where we're going to end up going. So we're using that as our baseline, and part of that would be looking at how to mitigate the impacts of our portfolio and to look at these risks that are going to be coming our way. And then obviously working with our legal department to see what we can do about that and how we can make provisions for that.
Thank you. Let's hear the final question.
Thank you. Hi everyone, my name is Niels Hazekamp. I work at Both Ends Foundation based in the Netherlands. First of all, I would like to say I'm in solidarity with Mrs. Duba. I can understand that all the impacts that you're facing, I mean, in such a discussion, talking about policies, I mean, what's in it for you? So I can really imagine this must be a difficult conversation, and thanks for speaking out. The question that I have is towards Glen. You talked about 10 principles for just energy transition principles. Could you say something more about where we can find those, how they were made, etc.? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So the 10 principles are in the presentation, and we'll play a short video again of them, which explains them a little bit more. And then they'll also be available. We're still workshopping, so this is part of the process of getting input into those principles. Like I explained, we did a town hall in South Africa to get some input. This is an ongoing process. And so they will be available on our website, which is fairfinancesouthernafrica.org. You'll be able to see them there in more detail. We already have, I think it's about a 2 or 3 page document of them. And obviously, as I say, any more feedback we get from events like this, we'll go into those to try and refine them and create principles that we think will be applicable for public finance institutions, but also for other institutions looking at just transition and climate finance.
Well, thank you, Glen. And well, I'm afraid those are the questions we have time for today. Thank you for active participation, and thank you to all the panelists for your input. As we heard from the Fair Finance Coalition, there is a need for strong policies, transparency, and climate finance that responds to climate justice. And I would like to thank for the opportunity to moderate this side event, as HIVO's message is aligned with the message of the Fair Finance Coalition. Public financing institutions in the Global South and North need to change the policies and get out of fossil fuels. And they also need to set targets for funding to locally led climate solutions, like the Indigenous Fund led by Indigenous peoples, which I have mentioned earlier. If public finance institutions just shift their money into large-scale projects, such as solar installations and electric vehicle factories, then it may be a green transition, but it won't be a just transition, because those on the front lines of climate impact will continue to be excluded, will continue to be impacted. And it's time that their voices are heard. It's time for them to be part and take part in the decisions that must be made today. It is time for climate justice. We invite you now to... Thank you. We invite you to pick up a copy of the report at the back of the room and to some light refreshments. Please continue to provide feedback, and you can keep interacting with the Fair Finance Coalition Southern Africa on social media using the hashtag FairFinanceSA. Thank you all for coming.